you for joining the webinar. I'm delighted to introduce you to our guest speakers today, Steve Witt, Group Head of Tax for the last 20 years at Hayes. Prior to this, Steve spent 20 years as HMRC when his roles included running a number of tax districts and being a senior investigator at HMRC Special Compliance Office. During his time, he was responsible for investigating sports stars, pop stars, captains of industries, and even one arms dealer. We also welcome Jeff Fawcett. Jeff is Head of Corporate Engagement for Hayes in the UK and Ireland. Most of his work involves developing enhanced solutions across both permanent and interim workforces. As such, since 2017, a lot of his work has been advising current customers on the potential issues and opportunities that IR35 presents. Jeff sits on the CBI Steering Committee on this subject. Jeff, if I could please pass across to you to start.
Pass across to Steve to start with. Steve. Morning, everyone. I guess if you're like me, you will have eagerly anticipated the budget statement on Monday, curious to see what were the latest twists and turns in the IR35 story. But we weren't disappointed with some predictable announcements, and I guess some not so predictable ones too. More on that later. I guess if we can take a quick look at the agenda at what we'll be covering today. We're starting with a brief recap of the rules around IR35. We'll then go on to the budget statement from Monday and see what that holds for us going forward. And then I'll pass you over to Jeff, who will look at the potential impacts on your organisation of the new rules. And I guess the important thing for you guys is what you should be doing now in terms of any strategies going forward. So, a brief recap of IR35, and please accept my apologies for those of you for whom this is a well-trodden path, but I thought it was worth just covering some of the bigger points around the rules as they exist right now. So what is IR35? Essentially, it's legislation aimed at tackling tax avoidance through the interposition of a personal service company between an individual who supplies their services and the person to whom those services are supplied. Essentially, what HMRC would argue is, but for the interposition of that personal service company, the relationship between the worker and the engager would be an employee-employer relationship. Now, historically, the onus has been on the individual to determine whether he or she falls inside IR35 or not. And surprise, surprise, HMRC argued that most people, or many people who should find themselves inside IR35 fail to actually do so. Now, this has proved a big problem for HMRC because the policing around IR35, in a practical sense, entails many investigations, taking a huge amount of man-hours for HMRC, running separate investigations into the individuals concerned. In 2017, they took the opportunity to do what HMRC do on many occasions, and I've witnessed this in my life with them, which is pass over the policing of these rules to somebody else. And in 2017, that somebody else was the public sector. And what happened at that time was, whilst the rules around IR35 didn't change at all, the responsibility for determining who falls inside or outside IR35, certainly for public sector engagers, passed over to that engager. To help the engagers of the personal service companies, HMRC provided an online tool, a CEST tool, into which essentially you provide information and outcomes and an outcome as to whether Steve Witts of Steve Witts Limited falls inside or outside IR35. Now, that online tool has been the subject of considerable criticism, and HMRC, interestingly, in the latest budget announcement, are talking about its continuing development, so there's more to be seen around that piece of work. What we are seeing in a practical sense already following the introduction of the rules in 2017 is that HMRC are already starting to audit some of the public sector engagers to test whether the decisions they are making around IR35 have been sound. I mean, again, this is one opportunity that HMRC have grasped to do essentially what is one-stop shopping around the policing of IR35, and they're wasting no opportunity whatsoever to take advantage of that. The last bullet, or last bottom right box on the slide you're looking at right now, is a very interesting one. The public sector legislation, as it came in, talks about liability for any unpaid tax falling on the fee payer. So essentially, the public sector engager determines whether Steve Witts is inside or outside R35, but if they are not the fee payer of Steve Witts Limited, then essentially there is no liability on them, unless, that is, that particular body engages Steve Witts directly. So there's a real mismatch between engagers in the public sector and those who engage through third parties. To reinforce that, the direct engagements through the public sector means that any decisions that are incorrect around IR35 mean that that public sector engager is personally responsible for any unpaid tax. Not so if that public sector engages through a third party, maybe a recruitment agency, or even that Steve Witts of Steve Witts Limited is ultimately paid by an umbrella organisation who provide him with accountancy services. In that instance, the liability then sits with the fee payer. So what are the factors that determine whether an engagement is inside or outside R35? Well, essentially, it's a combination of two things. First of all, the engagement that the individual embarks upon, and secondly, the manner in which that person conducts themselves. And again, the test is essentially whether Steve Witts is an employee or a freelance businessman. It's back to this age-old master-servant relationship, and whether the relationship between the two parties is employee or employee-employer. The tests to emerge that determine whether Steve Witts is inside or outside R35 are not based on statute, but a vast array of case law from ready-mix concrete and many others like it. And what you can see there are the bullet points that essentially the courts have used to determine whether Steve Witts is an employee or freelance self-employed person. And they, in no particular order, include things like control and supervision. So an employee is typically controlled and supervised in a very strong way. So he or she will be informed about the standard hours, will be instructed as to what the pay and terms and conditions are, will generally be given a staff handbook, and will have their roles and responsibilities managed, often through KPIs, and a management team. Less so with individuals who are freelance, for whom the work is, in an ideal world, project-based, well-defined, and there's a deliverable at the end of a particular period. The right to substitution is another important one that's emerged in the courts in terms of whether someone's self-employed or an employee. And this really strikes at the heart of IR35, because the rules are essentially about personal relationships, an individual providing service to an organisation. And if the right of substitution exists, it really breaks that link that the services are provided by Steve Witts and Steve Witts alone, in which case IR35 could well apply. There are other tests here. I won't go through them all because it's a well-trodden path. All you listening will probably be aware of many of the features that would help determine whether Steve Witts is inside or outside R35. But it's one of those situations where in any body of workers, a population of say 100, you will probably find that the top 20 will be easy to determine as outside R35, and maybe the bottom 20 will be easily determinable as inside R35. But often there's an unsatisfactory body in the middle where lines are blurred. And that really leaves the engager and you guys policing these rules with a sense of uncertainty as to whether the determinations you're making are correct and could possibly be overturned by HMRC. The last bullet is an interesting one. In terms of these rules, in a football parlance, if someone has an office within the meaning of the tax legislation, then it's a straight red because PAYE applies. And this was essentially aimed at what HMRC perceived as a mischief, where often non-executive directors on the boards of companies would invoice that company through their personal service company. That can't happen now under the new rules, and if anyone holds an office essentially within the meanings of the company's house definition, so director, non-executive director, company secretary, then the PAYE needs to be applied. So, where were we before the autumn budget? What's happened is there's been a temporary advantage for the private sector organisations who now, to the workers, operate through personal service companies, appear a more attractive place to work. HMRC has trailed in their consultation paper back in May of this year that they were looking to introduce similar rules that were in the public sector into the private sector. And the consultation responses were needed to be in by August of this year. Hayes and other organisations like us, needless to say, responded to that consultation process. And HMRC, again, trailed in their consultation document the idea that after dismissing one or two other possibilities around IR35 and new rules that could have been introduced, they essentially said what they introduced into the public sector in 2017 was essentially going to be replicated in the private sector. Again, to reinforce the point, the rules for determining whether an individual falls inside or outside IR35 have not changed at all. The only point here is that the organisation who determines whether Steve Witts of Steve Witts Limited is inside or outside IR35 is the engager. So, what happened in the budget on Monday that changes anything? Well, good news and bad news, I guess. The bad news is HMRC have confirmed that despite the consultation responses, they will still be bringing in this legislation, and it will be the responsibility of the engager in the private sector to make decisions as to whether Steve Witts is inside or outside R35. I guess the slightly better news is you have slightly more time now to arrange things, in that the new rules will not be applying until 2020. Interestingly, and this was something we didn't expect, is that HMRC announced that this will only now apply to medium and large businesses. And they estimate that about 1.5 businesses will be taken outside this decision-making process as a consequence of this. What I think is the big takeaway from the budget on Monday is that HMRC have, I think, been surprised by the level of responses and the power of the responses in terms of the consultation process. And many of those consultation responses have said that they didn't believe that the introduction into the public sector has gone as swimmingly well as HMRC would have everyone believe. And certainly that's the view of Hayes as an organisation. And I think the fact that HMRC has turned down what is a vast amount of potential tax take to defer this to 2020 means that they have at least responded to some of those criticisms and to the fact that the wide belief is in the market that the public sector implementation did not go as well as HMRC would have everyone believe. Interestingly, in their brief on IR35, they have announced that they do not intend going forward to use decisions that workers are inside IR35 as an opportunity to run investigations into earlier periods when that same worker might have been finding himself or herself outside of IR35. Essentially where we are now is that HMRC have announced that they will take further consultation on the legislation and that they anticipate that draft legislation will be proposed in the summer of 2019, ready for an April 2020 implementation. That, I guess, is a brief overview of where we are right now in terms of the tax analysis, and I'll hand you over to Jeff, who will take you through some of the market impacts.
Thanks, Steve. Firstly, to say I'm really pleased that it's 2020 and not 2019. Our experiences across the public sector is simply that organisations were not equipped to deal with the speed that legislation came in and caused severe impact. It's great that it's there for 2020, but that certainly doesn't mean you don't need to address this challenge sooner rather than later. I think there are major risks to this change, but there are also, in fact, opportunities there as well. So what are the challenges? And I think one of the big issues here is around the internal capability and resource that organisations have to address this. Now, have you got the capability to cover the following areas? Can you undertake a full due diligence across your non-perm resource, including your PSC population? Can you make the determinations across all the PSCs, irrespective of the source, be that directly or indeed via third parties? I think that's a critical point here. You'll be required to make the determination and own the liability, as we see it, on all directly engaged PSCs. You could also be asked to verify the tax compliance across your supply chain under the Criminal Finances Act 2017. So again, do you have the resources to cover these types of challenges? So what are the potential impacts of this, and what did we see across the public sector when it came into play in 2017? Well, there's a potential for significant increased costs, somewhere up to the region of 30%, if you deem to move people across from to become paid under a PAYE. There is significant loss of talent. We heard this from most of our public sector organisations as people just moved away and moved into different organisations. It became so critical that there were a number of projects that were cancelled altogether, but many projects were actually delayed, many being in the technology space. I think also you've got to expect pushback from the contractor workforce. IR35 is not new to them, as Steve's alluded to. It's best part of 20 years old, so they will be very protective of their outside IR35 status, and again that will cause a significant amount of work. And then importantly, going forward, I think you need to come out of this being regarded as an organisation that's a destination of choice, as opposed to a destination that people frankly really don't want to go to. So there's certainly a messaging in the market as contractors, as we all know, tend to talk. So there is an opportunity to this, and this is the glass half empty, glass half full slide. I think it's important to realise that IR35 is not just another layer of legislation of an already challenging and complex job of managing a non-perm workforce. It really amplifies each and every one of the common risks and challenges an organisation faces when dealing with contractors and freelancers. And some of this slide may already resonate very strongly with you. I think as an example, let's look at the challenge of control. And when there is no central hiring mechanism in an organisation, the outcome is generally a lack of control and visibility over the contingent workforce estate. Typically, there's no overarching MI, so clarity around how many people are on-site, off-site, pay, charges, tenure, who's supplying their performance is very uncertain, and I think it leads to inefficiencies, poor compliance, higher costs, and often quite poor decision-making based on incorrect assumptions as to the true makeup of the organisation's workforce. And not having this clarity when HMRC come knocking at the door for their IR35 audit saying how many contingent workers have you engaged, you are trying to capture that data very reactively. It will only make the job of running a contingent worker estate harder and potentially more costly. I think we're all familiar with the old management adage, you can't improve what you can't measure. And I think the arrival of the IR35 changes will necessitate a new approach for not only engaging and managing, but also monitoring and measuring the contingent workforce. The IR35 changes will be another layer of compliance. Any solution needs to be baked into the organisation's processes, its systems, its culture, and its people. I think hopefully you can see the IR35 as a catalyst opportunity to get your non-perm workforce in order and get better from this is often a quite expensive resource. So, what should you do now? Well, looking at the in excess of 1,000 people that are on this call, we can see a number of people who are heads of IT, HR directors, procurement, heads of resourcing, people from tax. So it's fairly clear that there are a number of people who have sight of this. But I think fundamentally there has to be an owner in an organisation and an exec board sponsor. Certainly our experience within key public sector clients suggests that this process is essential. And I would suggest from a time frame that if this is not already in place and you haven't established an owner, this is certainly done pre-Christmas, if not already established. I think now we understand the context and background, we need to start identifying where the IR35 risk lies, how big is it, what is the scale of the problem. And again, in our view, this needs to be done and completed by the latest of Q1 next year. And really the first point's key, and it's what it comes down to. How many contingent workers are you in your organisation? And it still surprises me the household names some of the household names we speak to to date who still don't have a strong visibility of this. The next point, once you know that, is clearly, how are they getting paid? Is it under limited companies, is it PAYE, and how much? How are they engaged contractually? Are they sole traders, PSC, statement of work? Another very key point is, are you paying the workers invoices directly, because they will be complete line of sight and liability responsibility to you directly. And what broad processes do you have in place to capture the above? Who captures it? Broadly, how accurate is it? And is it captured reactively as opposed to you being able to press a button today and work out all of this? The final point is really around what are the workers and hiring managers doing from a behavioural perspective? Are you treating PSCs the same as PAYEs, which you absolutely can't do? I think it's important to remember that it's the behavioural aspect that the HMRC focus on as much as the contractual relationship a worker has with the engaging organisations. I think answering these questions will give you an idea of your state of readiness, and of course we can assist you with this discovery phase. I think it's clear now that IR35 will be front and centre of pretty much every contingent worker in the private sector. So the contingent workers working on site are going to want to know what the strategy will be. Consequently, hiring managers also need to be aware of the plan. We can help you with this piece of work, but it's vital that your stakeholders understand what is the risk, the challenge, as well as the messaging and approach. And perhaps run it as a project with a C-level sponsor, and once the plan is in place, then it's easier to manage, monitor, and review. Because this has already come into play in the public sector, there will be a strong expectation that the private sector will get to grips with this more efficiently and effectively due to the longer lead time and the lessons learned from the public sector. I think it's no longer something that's new. It's important to say there's no off-the-shelf approach that will work for everyone. It needs to be a tailored solution, and every organisation will have a different level of risk and how they're engaging people and looking at their internal processes. If there is a lack of resource in-house to do this, then it's definitely worth approaching a third party who has the expertise and a track record in this area of specialism. So I think a really strong message that I want you to take away is that you need to work on an assignment by assignment basis. You need to be able to work with parties who can provide expert testing, can give you advice and challenge you on things like services versus job specs. I think we need to move away from kind of lazy hiring and look at the outputs of what you're expecting people to be able to achieve. Another key note around here is that if the population is relatively significant, typically 40 plus, there is a consideration to look at an outsourced solution and an MSP option. I'll leave you with this final slide, just really from covering our support with our customers on this. We've developed a solution where we take full responsibility for assessing the IR35 status of your contractors, which means that organisations such as yourself will avoid the burden, disruption and cost in tackling the problem. The tax status of the contingent workforce is determined by experienced tax assessment experts instead of relying on a binary web-based tool like CEST. As an organisation, you achieve an accurate status determination which will stand up to any HMRC audit. We can also provide support in planning phase by doing upfront audits, run training, and help you plan your solution. So whilst you start talking to your line managers, exec boards and contractors, do talk to us. Thank you. I'll now open the session up to a Q&A. Let's see what we have. Steve, if I can bring you in for your final advice at this point.
Shall I pick up on a couple of questions I've noticed have come through? First of all, someone has asked what would be the definition of a small business that will be excluded under the rules as proposed by HMRC and Treasury in the latest budget announcement. Well, of course, I'm going to caveat this first of all by saying we will need to see any draft legislation before we fully understand who is excluded and who is included. But in the accompanying notes that HMRC released on Monday, what they said is that the criteria for small businesses is similar to those defined in the Companies Act 2006. Now, the definitions in Companies Act 2006 is you are a small business if you do not exceed two of the following three criteria. The first one is that you have a turnover of less than 10.2 million. You have a balance sheet value of less than 5.1 million, and you have less than 50 employees. So if you hit two of those three, you are a small business within the meaning of the Companies Act 2006, and if HMRC's announcements on Monday are anything to go by, you will be excluded from these rules. But as I say, just to be careful in terms of making any rash judgments, we do need to see the legislation proposed by HMRC before we actually go firm on that. The second question that I've seen appear is someone asking about a description of mutuality of obligation. So one of the key determining factors as to whether a contractor falls inside or outside IR35 is mutuality of obligation. And indeed, mutuality of obligation is one of the criticisms that's been levied at HMRC in terms of their CEST tool. They say that not enough cognizance is paid to mutuality of obligation and it needs revising. HMRC have recognised that the CEST tool does need revising and it's going to go through further sort of improvements. So what is mutuality of obligation? Well, essentially, if you look at mutuality of obligation for an employee, it's essentially a long-term offer that if the individual turns up for work, there will be work for him or her to do, they will get paid as a consequence of turning up for work, and that offer will be essentially in perpetuity unless the employee decides to get their notice in or does something which means that the employment will be terminated. Essentially, there's an offer of work and a promise to pay an individual who turns up to do that work. Now, that long-term obligation is not present in such a strong way for contractors. Sure, on a short-term basis, there will be mutuality of obligation, even for a contract for a temporary worker that lasts just a week. So for that particular week, there will be a promise that if Steve Woods turns up to do a week's work, he will be paid, and every day for that week, there will be an expectation he turns up and work will be there for him. However, for a temporary worker, that does not last in perpetuity. So the following week, the services of that particular contractor, Steve Witts, might not be needed. There is no long-term obligation for the engager to provide work for Steve Witts, and therefore that mutuality of obligation is broken. And actually, the absence of mutuality of obligation makes it look more like a freelancer than an employee.
Another question here. Probably Steve, if I can hand this one to you. Why do you think they've kept the smaller companies out?
Well, HMRC are attempting to reduce the administrative burden on small organisations that employ people. It's just trying to strip away the burden on them. This, I guess, is another of those measures in an attempt to try and ease position for small organisations who very often by VAT returns, PAY returns, are just tied up in knots by red tape and bureaucracy.
Thank you. I mean, I think that might present a challenge to perhaps some of the larger companies who are seeing, some of their talent move away for the smaller companies going forward. I've got another question here. You mentioned having responsibilities linked to your suppliers/supply chain. Do you have a view how that will work practically at this stage? I think this falls under the Criminal Finance Act, doesn't it, in essence, and it's really saying that you need to be able to have assurance around your full supply chain. Stevie.
One of the proposals that HMRC put forward in their consultation paper was that individual organisations should essentially check the tax purity, the tax compliance of those in their supply chain, and that doesn't necessarily just mean the contractor, him or herself, but organisations attached to that individual. So very often the contractor will have an umbrella stroke accountancy firm that does their tax returns and all the sort of tax and finance piece around that. They too will be kind of subject to scrutiny. HMRC have not yet dismissed the possibility that the engagers will need to review the supply chain for tax compliance, but that is exactly what might be proposed. But as Jeff suggests, the Criminal Finance Act 2017, which actually wasn't a piece of legislation aimed at IR35 at all, its genesis is entirely separate, but it essentially says that any organisation has to be very aware and ensure that its employees or those in its supply chain, so its business partners and associates, do not proliferate or encourage tax evasion. Now, one of the things that we see as an organisation, and if you check any kind of websites, contractor websites, very often there are heroic claims that a contractor will be able to take home 90% of their income that they get paid gross. Now, we all know that the effective tax rate for employees in the UK is not 10%, so any claims of that nature must mean that there's some, I guess HMRC would argue, fancy footwork in terms of tax going on. So engagers need to be very cognizant of that and to ensure that they are not essentially caught in the crossfire of those people who might be in their supply chain.
Okay, I've got another question here. I think it's probably to both of us. Hi, if someone does fall under IR35, do we have any other options than looking to move them to PAYE? Steve, can I start you with that?
I guess, I mean, the employment is the easy answer, because if someone is caught by IR35, then it's hard to imagine if one assessment comes up with an inside IR35, unless the individual fundamentally changed the methodology through which they work and the assignment that they're working on changes, that any other organisation will find them anything other than inside IR35. So if those are the circumstances and inside IR35 is the sensible decision, then I guess the message is, to all intents and purposes, that individual is being treated as an employee, and maybe employment is the option.
Yeah. And I think this was, back to my point earlier around cost increase, this is where we saw significant cost increase across the public sector, because with that, if you're paying a contractor, let's say £400 a day, and being charged $450, all of a sudden, then you've got employers' NI costs to put in. Plus the fact our experience was that a lot of the contractors then wanted increases in rates on top. So the numbers moved up fairly heavily from there.
There's one other I can see here where saying HMRC have said that they will not use the decision-making process by engagers as a means of looking back to earlier years and maybe running investigations into contractors who found themselves outside R35. Is there a responsibility on engagers to review historically the circumstances of the contractor to see whether they should have been inside R35? The answer to that is no. the legislation will be coming in 2020. The responsibility for the engager starts from 2020. Before that, responsibility for determining whether the contractor falls inside or outside R35 remains with the contractor and his intermediary, which is the personal service company through which he or she is engaged. It's interesting because HMRC have said that they're not going to use these decision-making processes as a means of going back. That's not to say they won't do it if the circumstances are such that it's patently obvious to them that the outside R35 decision prior to 2020 is actually flagrantly incorrect. But it is correct that they don't have the manpower to be able to run vast amounts of investigations. So I think they're essentially pleased that going forward they now have a very efficient method of policing IR35, and on that basis are content to let sleeping dogs lie in terms of the earlier periods.
Okay. There seems to be a number of questions around the smaller company piece.
Yeah, many of the questions coming through are essentially looking at the possibility of essentially splitting their organisations into smaller pieces, which means that they will all be subject to the exemption that HMRC provide. I suspect that's a simplistic view of things because, as with any piece of legislation, HMRC will inevitably protect themselves by saying anyone who does this essentially will have a piece of legislation which allows them to, crudely speaking, put back together a group that's been fragmented solely for the purposes of avoiding this. And you see similar legislation around VAT where people split businesses to take advantage of the registration thresholds. So it's a possibility, I guess, theoretical possibility, but I suspect HMRC will be very cognizant of the possibility of doing that and will provide anti-avoidance legislation that stops people from finding themselves outside the rules.
Good question here. Apart from the CES test, is there any other checks and tests that we must do before taking on a consultant? What can we do to show we have done everything from our end? I think on that one, the commentary around CES and the feedback on CES to date has been perhaps mixed, would be fair, and I think we've seen audits coming back through on CES, which, let's not forget, is a fairly binary determination measure, where those checks have been tested and what's been challenged is the input into there. The work that we do in terms of testing is utilising our in-house capability, which includes somebody like Steve, but also we use the market-leading third-party tax advisor to give us additional assurance around the testing procedure.
As I trailed earlier, the CES tool has gone through various iterations, and HMRC have recognised that it's not a perfect assessment process, and therefore are continuing to make improvements to it. They argue, or have originally argued, that they ran 24 cases, decided cases, that appeared before the courts through the CES tool, and the CES tool got 22 out of 24 correct. Now, there are contractor websites who take different cases and argue that the performance of the CES tool is woefully inadequate when you compare them to the analysis that they did. It's all very subjective, but essentially it is going through some further testing phases. Interestingly, there was a case recently where HMRC, or the CES tool, found a contractor to be inside IR35. That decision was challenged, and that challenge ultimately ended up in the courts, and the courts found that the individual was outside IR35. So here we have a case where the courts, having considered something, or some circumstances where the HMRC tool found them inside, actually determined that they were outside. So clearly, there is scope for difference between the courts and the CES tool. As Jeff said, the CES tool essentially is a fairly, we would argue, blunt instrument. The rules around determining whether someone's inside or IR35 are fairly nuanced and delicate judgments based on many, many tax cases. So to ask any machine, essentially, to produce a result without any human intervention, I think is a heroic assumption.
I think we've got time for a couple more. Please confirm that in the case of a direct engagement with a PSC, the onus to determine the IR35 status and liability to tax lies with the hirer. Absolutely.
Correct. And that is a cautionary note for all engagers of personal service companies. If the relationship is a direct one and you end up paying that personal service company yourselves, you are, in terms of the legislation, the fee payer, and therefore responsibility lies with you.
We've got a really interesting question here. IR35 should provide a level playing field. How can compliant businesses compete when others abuse the system? I think with that, yes, there is a big discussion around now. Private sector and public sector will be operating from the same level playing field in 2020. It should be easier, but the question around abusing the system, I think what we saw, the challenges we saw in the public sector was when organisations came out with blanket in-scope determinations, they became organisations that people didn't want to navigate towards. So it moved people away. I don't think we necessarily saw a huge impact of people abusing the system, but we saw people making blanket in-scope determinations, which probably fared against that organisation. And I think there is now more of a level playing field between public and private. However, within private, you need to be deemed as a destination of choice and an organisation that are treating these rules in the right manner, I think, is probably the fair way to answer that. Anything else in there? Steve? No. I think final one here, final question. Does IR35 currently apply to non-executive directors or only from April 2020 in the private sector?
HMRC would argue that PAY would always have applied to non-executive director because the rules around employment income talk about income from an office or employment, and HMRC have always argued that a non-executive director has an office within the meaning of the tax legislation. So what they're doing with this piece of legislation is actually reinforcing what they already believed. So I would say PAY would apply as of now.
Good. I think we've got to wrap up there. So I'd just like to say thank you for joining us today. On our website, we've put in a lot of the webinars and documentation that we've published around IR35, so you can catch up on that on hayes.co.uk/IR35. We've got a number of events going on around the country, so if they fall into where you are, please do register to attend on that. And clearly, if there are any specific requests, queries, help, there's an email there, ir35@hayes.com. So thanks again for your time and wish you a good day.